the legend of Mu first began in the writings of Augustus Le Plongeon after his investigations of the Mayan ruins in the Yucatan. His work with translating parts of the Popol Vuh led him to believe that Mu was associated with the lost continent of Atlantis and wrote about it as such. However, Mu as a lost continent in the Pacific began with a man named James Churchward, who met with Plongeon and his wife in 1885 after their 12-year excursion in the Yucatan. The hypotheses are featured in a series of books written by Churchward between 1926 and 1933. He claimed that when he was a young man serving as a soldier in India, a high-ranking temple priest showed him an ancient set of clay tablets that only 2 others could read. James said that he convinced the priest to teach him the ancient language, and that upon reading them, he learned that they came from a place where man first appeared, Mu. James gave a vivid account of an ancient advanced civilization, the Nacals, who flourished sometime between 50,000 and 12,000 years ago. Mu was said to have 64 million inhabitants and 7 major cities, with colonies established throughout the other continents. The entire population was separated into 10 tribes and followed one government and one spirituality. He said that the continent was located in the Pacific Ocean and was 5,000 miles east to west and 3,000 miles from north to south. He also stated that it had massive plains, vast rivers, rolling hills, large bays and estuaries, and that eventually it was obliterated in almost a single night after a series of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. After Mu sank, its inhabitants would become the founders of the great civilizations of Egypt, Central America, India, and others, and was the source of the world's ancient megalithic architecture. According to James, the king of Mu was named Ra, and he said this was related to the Egyptian god Ra, as well as the Rapa Nui word for the sun, Ra'ah. Looking to the Bible, James also made a note that Moses had trained by the Nacal Brotherhood in Egypt, and he believed that the Assyrians mistranslated the Garden of Eden story, suggesting that it should have been in the Pacific Ocean. Today, most archaeologists insist that the legends of Mu are pure pseudo-archaeology, end of story. But what I find interesting about this is that at the very least, there's some evidence that appears to support the idea. Let's begin with the geography. Now, the legends of Mu suggest that it was a massive continent in the Pacific Ocean, and there are a few accounts as to what this place looked like. While James suggested it was a long continent with rolling hills and many rivers, Drumfellow's account in the Flower of Life book suggested it was not a single island, but a stretch of islands of varying sizes, a massive archipelago ranging from the area around Hawaii through Polynesia and all the way to Easter Island. In floor maps of the Pacific Ocean, you can see this stretch of mountainous bodies underwater, which could have had both massive islands as well as supporting many little islands as well, were it at the surface of the ocean. There are several other ancient discoveries which could potentially be physical evidence of Mu, from Japan's underwater site at Yonaguni to the cryptic petroglyphs on Hawaii. And that's not to mention Easter Island. We know today that many of the remarkable features of Easter Island, such as the legendary Easter Island heads, which were recently discovered to have traces of full bodies, were only built in the last 1,000 years. But Easter Island also has an ancient written text in a language called Rongo-Rongo, although it's unclear as to whether or not this is writing or proto-writing. If it is in fact a full writing system, it could be one of the only surviving cases of an independent invention of an alphabet ever in history. These surviving tablets are a huge mystery for us today, as the language has still not been deciphered. When we put these findings together, it seems to indicate higher levels of advancement in ancient cultures than we currently understand, which is made even more interesting because of the remote location seemingly in the middle of nowhere. Looking to the Rapa Nui people of Easter Island, we actually find a similar story to the legends of Mu. In one of their creation myths, we find a story of a great and beautiful continent that they called Hiva. One night, the king of Hiva received a message in a dream that his land would sink, and sure enough, this vision came to pass. Thanks to the king and his dream, however, the people were guided to a new land, which was Easter Island, and there they survived the disappearance of their homeland. Historical and scientific investigations on the people of Easter Island suggest that Polynesians from the Marquesas Islands traveled from the west to their new home, but the date is unknown, with estimates for their arrival ranging anywhere between 300 to 1200 AD, perhaps even further back given the lack of evidence. This seems to show that the myth of Easter Island has more historical truth to it than mere fable, They did in fact migrate to Easter Island, and one wonders what other parts of the myth may also prove to be true. Stepping back to the history of the people of Mu, in the ancient secret of the flower of life, Drunvalo described that the descendants of Adam and Eve were taken by Enki to Mu, although he used the name Lemuria, so that they could safely grow and develop their consciousness on their own, without interference from the slave miners or the Anunnaki, who were still mining Africa for its gold and inhabiting their cities and temples across the Middle East. There are a few different theories regarding the timeline of Mu. Some theories place Mu's existence from about 75,000 years ago to 30,000 years ago, and it was at that time that it sank and Atlantis rose. Others believe that Lemuria and Atlantis existed at the same time, which is what we find in James Churchward's version of the story. In Drunvalo's telling, on Mu, humans evolved to a very high level of consciousness, where we became capable of doing things that would seem almost impossible to us today. Supposedly, we experienced a reality where matter was less dense and more permeable to our thoughts and feelings. And so we were able to levitate, move through solid objects, and other amazing feats. In a way, we were kind of like young deities. He also wrote that on this continent, the first mystery school was created. It was founded by two people who discovered the gift of immortality, who then taught this ability to approximately 1,000 others before the time came when Mu sank. This event is described as a terrifying cataclysm, which we find two predominant versions for depending on the timeline. James Churchward suggested that the main mineral of the landmass of Mu was granite and was honeycombed with huge shallow chambers and cavities filled with explosive gases. And due to volcanic activity underneath the continent, it released tremendous explosions, causing the continent to sink. As with most legends of a lost civilization, the stories all describe that Mu or Lemuria, for one reason or another, sank beneath the waves, leaving no remnant of it behind, and the survivors made their way to new homes. And one common theory about where they went was a new continent called Atlantis. Sort of a fun side note here. Do you remember way back in the original human history movie where we started by saying, well, this?
This story spans back hundreds of thousands of years into our past. It talks about Tiamat and Nibiru, the Nephilim, seeding the human race, Adam and Eve, and the children of Lemuria. This portion of the story is really interesting, but not the most crucial to know. We're not going to be covering this at this time. We are, however, going to be picking up the story at the end of Lemuria and discussing the events of Atlantis up to present day.
Well, guess what? We're here. I'm so happy to at long last bring some context to the beginning of that particular story. However, there's still more to cover that we previously hadn't. And for those who haven't seen the original human history movie yet, we'll make sure to cover the basics as well so that you won't be left out. Though, you can always go watch that one right after this is done. It was at this point that another mass migration occurred, where the children of Mu found a new home, and they called it Atlantis. So, Atlantis. The best place to start here is with the origins of this myth. The first account of Atlantis actually came from Plato in his writings called Timaeus and Critias from about 360 BC. He discussed an ancient kingdom called Atlantis located on an island in the Atlantic Ocean, somewhere beyond the Pillars of Hercules in the modern-day Straits of Gibraltar. Today, the modern consensus around the story is that Atlantis is purely fictitious, a parable used for educational purposes or to glorify Athens in the eyes of Plato. And while most people believe this, there are those who suggest otherwise.
It's rather interesting that Plato, who is the earliest surviving source for the story of Atlantis, tells us that he got it from his relative Solon, who in turn got it from the ancient Egyptians, and that they spoke of a time 9,000 years before the time of Solon. That's 9,600 BC, or 11,600 years before the present. Academics think that Plato made it all up. But if Plato made it all up, it's extraordinary that he chose that date and that time, around 12,000 years ago, because that was absolutely at the peak of the meltdown of the last ice age, when there was indeed global flooding.